At 4:50 in the morning on the first Saturday of June, Ethan Marsh clipped a headlamp to his cap, shouldered a day pack, and started up a trail toward the summit of a 14,000-foot peak in the Colorado Rockies. He had done this exact hike, or ones very much like it, more than 30 times. By 11:40 that morning, he was dead at the base of a snowfield roughly 400 feet below the summit ridge, having slid the entire distance on hard, refrozen snow with nothing on his hands, his feet, or his back that could have stopped him. This is the story of one of the most common and most misunderstood killers in Colorado's high country. Not a storm, not a fall from a technical route, but a simple glissade that went wrong on a mountain a man knew well. Ethan Marsh was 41, a Denver-based structural engineer who had been climbing Colorado's 14ers, the state's 50-plus peaks above 14,000 feet, for almost 15 years. By the summer this story takes place, he had summited 46 of them, a fact he mentioned with a mix of pride and self-deprecation to nearly everyone he hiked with. He wasn't reckless. Friends and hiking partners described him as methodical, someone who read trip reports obsessively before a climb, checked weather multiple times in the days leading up to a hike, and had turned back on summit attempts before, more than once when conditions looked wrong. He owned real mountaineering gear, an ice axe, crampons, trekking poles with snow baskets, and knew, in principle, exactly when each piece of equipment was supposed to come out of the closet. He had also, over 15 years of climbing, developed something that shows up in almost every experienced outdoors person eventually, a comfortable, well-earned confidence that occasionally outpaced the specific situation in front of him. 46 summits is a lot of data telling your brain that you generally know what you're doing on a mountain. It is also subtly a lot of data training your brain to trust pattern recognition over the specific conditions of the one day currently in front of you. This particular 14er was one Ethan had climbed twice before, both times in mid to late summer, when the standard route was almost entirely dry trail and talus, save for a short seasonal snowfield near the top that, by August, was usually little more than a firm, walkable patch. He decided, somewhat spontaneously, to attempt it again in early June, a full 2 months earlier in the season than his previous climbs. A friend had cancelled on a planned trip that weekend, and rather than lose the weekend entirely, Ethan decided to solo it. He'd checked a recent trip report from another climber, posted 4 days earlier, describing some snow up high, nothing crazy, would recommend microspikes. He read this, registered it, and made a decision that would end up defining the entire outcome of the day. He decided his ice axe and crampons, sitting in his gear closet at home, were probably overkill for what the report described, and left them behind. He brought trekking poles. He did not own microspikes. This is worth sitting with because it's the single most consequential decision in the entire story, made 2 days before he ever set foot on the mountain. Early June in the Colorado high country is a genuinely different environment than the same trail in August, even on a peak a climber knows well. The winter's accumulated snowpack, still substantial at elevation in early summer, undergoes a specific and predictable daily cycle. It freezes hard overnight, then softens as the sun warms it through the morning and afternoon. A snowfield that might be soft, grippy, and easily kick-stepped by 1 p.m. can be a sheet of hard, nearly ice-like refrozen snow at 7 a.m., precisely the window when most 14y climbers, following the standard advice to summit early and beat afternoon thunderstorms, are actually crossing it. Ethan knew this pattern in the abstract. He had just never personally needed traction gear on this specific peak before because he had never climbed it this early in the season. The ascent went almost exactly as Ethan expected. He started in the dark, headlamp cutting a narrow beam across dry trail and loose talus for the first few miles, the standard early alpine start every experienced 14y climber uses to summit before Colorado's near-daily afternoon thunderstorms build over the peaks. By sunrise, he was well above tree line, moving at a strong, practiced pace. Around 8 a.m., he reached the base of the seasonal snowfield the trip report had mentioned, a broad, moderately angled slope crossing the upper section of the standard route, perhaps 600 vertical feet from top to bottom, that in summer months is typically bare rock and dirt. The snow here, at 8 in the morning, was still overnight hard, firm enough that his boots weren't sinking in, firm enough, in fact, that each step required a deliberate kick to get any purchase at all. This should have been the moment the trip report's advice mattered most. Would recommend microspikes. Without them, and without an ice axe for self-arrest capability, Ethan crossed the snowfield on the ascent using slow, careful kick steps and his trekking poles for balance, moving deliberately, testing each placement before committing weight. It worked. He made it across without incident, continued up the remaining scramble to the summit ridge, and reached the top a little before 9:30 a.m., his 47th 14er summit by his own count. He spent about 20 minutes at the top, ate a bar, took a few photos, texted his wife from the small patch of cell signal available at elevation to let her know he'd made it up safely and would be heading down soon. The descent began the way descents on snow-covered 14ers often do among experienced climbers, with a look at the same snowfield he'd carefully kick-stepped across on the way up, now several hours later, softened considerably by a few hours of direct June sun. This is where an idea took hold that is common enough among experienced mountaineers that it has its own informal name in hiking communities, the glissade shortcut. Rather than carefully redescending the snowfield on foot the same slow way he descended it, Ethan considered simply sitting down and sliding, a glissade in mountaineering terms, using his own body and a controlled sitting position to descend a snow slope quickly, the way a sledder might, using trekking poles or an ice axe dragged behind as a brake to control speed. Glissading is a legitimate, commonly used technique on many mountains under the right conditions. Snow soft enough to allow a boot heel or an axe to dig in and control speed, a slope with a clean run-out rather than rocks or a cliff edge below, and critically, some means of arresting the slide if it starts to accelerate beyond a controllable speed. Ethan had none of the specific gear this technique depends on for safety. No ice axe meant no reliable means of self-arrest if the glissade sped up. Trekking poles, unlike an axe, are not designed to dig into hard snow and hold a climber's weight against a rapid slide. They're far more likely to simply skip across a hard surface or snap under sideways load. What made the decision feel reasonable to Ethan in the moment was the same thing that makes it feel reasonable to climbers on 14ers across Colorado every single season. The snow, several hours into direct June sunlight, looked and felt considerably softer at the surface than it had at 8 a.m. He tested a boot heel into it near the top of the slope, and it dug in easily. What he didn't fully register was that this softening was surface level, a few inches of sun-warmed slush sitting on top of snow that remained considerably harder and more consolidated just beneath. Ethan sat down near the top of the snowfield, dug his heels in as a rough brake the way he'd done successfully on softer glissades in past seasons, and pushed off. For the first 30 or so feet, it worked exactly as expected, a controlled, moderate-speed slide, his heels digging into the soft surface layer enough to regulate his pace, trekking poles dragging beside him for additional control. Then the slope's angle steepened slightly, in a section that had received less direct sun exposure that morning and retained a harder, icier base beneath the same soft surface slush. His heels, which had been controlling his speed reliably on the softer snow above, suddenly found far less resistance. He began to accelerate. He tried to dig his poles in harder to slow himself, the instinctive reaction of someone using the wrong tool for the situation, since trekking poles, unlike an ice axe's broad pick and adze, have almost no ability to bite into firm snow and arrest real speed. One pole skipped off the hardening surface. He tried rolling onto his stomach in a self-arrest position he'd read about but never formally trained on, without an axe to actually anchor the attempt. By the time he was moving fast enough that any correction became essentially impossible, he had already covered several hundred feet of the slope, well beyond any point of controlled recovery. The snowfield's lower section ended not in the gentle, snow-covered runout that a safe glissade depends on, but in a transition to exposed talus and broken rock, a boundary that had been obscured from where Ethan started his slide by the angle of the slope itself, invisible until he was already well past the point of being able to stop before reaching it. He came off the bottom edge of the snow at considerable speed, the impact transitioning from a controlled, if too fast, slide into an uncontrolled tumble across rock. He fell the final stretch of the slope. Investigators would later estimate roughly 400 feet of total elevation lost from where the glissade began to where his body came to rest, sustaining injuries in the fall that were fatal. Another climbing party descending the same route, roughly 20 minutes behind him, came upon the scene and immediately called for help using a satellite communication device, one of the pieces of equipment that had become increasingly common among experienced 14er climbers in recent years, precisely because of how unreliable cell service is at elevation on most of Colorado's high peaks. Search and rescue reached the site within a few hours, but by the time any responder arrived, there was nothing left to do. Nothing about this story involves a single dramatic failure. It involves a chain of small, individually reasonable decisions, each one made by an experienced, careful climber, that combined into an outcome none of them would have chosen if considered together in advance. The decision to climb 2 months earlier in the season than his previous ascents, without adjusting his mental model of what the mountain would actually look like at that time of year. The decision to read a trip report's specific gear recommendation and quietly downgrade it based on his own broader experience, rather than the conditions described in that specific report. The decision to glissade a slope on the descent using trekking poles rather than an ice axe, based on how the surface snow felt in the first few feet rather than what lay beneath it further down the slope. And underlying all of it, the broader and more universal pattern, 46 prior successful summits generating a level of comfort with the mountain that didn't fully account for how much a single seasonal variable, snow condition in this case, could change the entire risk profile of a route he otherwise knew extremely well. Early season snow on Colorado's 14ers behaves in a way that surprises even highly experienced climbers, specifically because the surface can soften enough in a few hours of June sun to feel safe for exactly the kind of shortcut that depends on the snow beneath that surface being equally soft. It often isn't. An ice axe is not optional equipment on any 14er route carrying residual snow in early summer, regardless of how many times a climber has done the peak before in drier conditions, and regardless of how a trip report characterizes the snow a few days prior. Trekking poles cannot substitute for an axe's specific ability to arrest a slide on hard or icy snow, and glissading without one removes the single most important safety mechanism the technique depends on. The mountain Ethan Marsh climbed that day was the same mountain he'd summited twice before without incident. The only thing that had changed was the calendar and the specific invisible layer of hard snow sitting just beneath a few inches of deceptively soft June surface slush.